Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Sosowski of Oblong Books in New York's Hudson Valley. We're delighted to be your Zoom host for this wonderful event with author Julian Barnes for his new novel, Elizabeth Finch, which we're presenting in partnership with 5 esteemed independent bookstores from around the Northeastern United States, beginning with Books and Books in Miami, Florida. Hello to your audience. Hampton in East Hampton, New York. Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., and R.J. Julia in Madison, Connecticut. If you've not already ordered your copy of Elizabeth Finch, we encourage you to do so through your local independent bookstore, whichever one of us that may be. And I invite all of our collaborators to post their direct links to purchase in the chat so you can show your love. I'd like to thank Catherine Zuckerman of Knopf for bringing us all together for this event. It's really lovely to have the opportunity to collaborate like this with such respected bookstore colleagues. Before I introduce our interlocutor, a reminder that there will be a Q&A after the conversation, and you can leave your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. And now to introduce Julian, I'll turn things over to our host, Joe Donahue, of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Joe is the host of the Roundtable on WAMC and the Book Show. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all the bookstores, to Books and Books, Hampton, Harvard Bookstore, R.J. Julia, Politics and Prose. I have been to all but one, and for the one that I left out, you don't need to know that I haven't been there yet, but I will go, I promise. And of course, to my home bookstore, Oblong Books, who we have a wonderful partnership with and have worked with so long. Basically, what we're doing tonight, besides having a beautiful conversation with the amazing Julian Barnes, is we are also recording for a radio program, as Helen mentioned, called very ingeniously, The Book Show. And we'll be talking to Julian about his novel, Elizabeth Finch. So what I'm going to do is start with the introduction that will be on the radio, and then we'll go into our conversation. We'll go for about a half hour, and then after that, we will go to the Q&A and the chat. And again, thank you all for being with us. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you all here. Coming down in 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Best-selling award-winning author Julian Barnes' new novel, Elizabeth Finch, is a magnetic tale that centers on the presence of a vivid and particular woman whose loss becomes the occasion for a man's deeper examination of love, friendship, and biography. Barnes once again presents his eye for the unorthodox forms of love can take between two people, a compelling swerve into nonfiction material, this time through Neil's obsessive study of Julian the Apostate, following on notes that Elizabeth left for him to discover after her death. We'll get to that in a moment. And the forcefully moving undercurrent of history and biography in particular as nourishment and guide in our lives. Julian Barnes is the author of 24 previous books for which he has received the Man Booker Prize, the Somerset Maugham Award, the E.M. Forster Award, and the Jerusalem Prize. It is a great pleasure, a great honor to welcome Julian Barnes to this week's book show. Thank you so much for being with us. What a delight.
Nice to be with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but this is a way of being in 5 or 6 places at once.
Which is very nice and very handy for all of us. And we thank you for doing it and taking the time out. Give us a sense of, there are several elements to this novel which we will talk about, but what the initial impetus was for you to create this amazing woman, Elizabeth Finch.
I think I wanted to write about a woman who was unusual, somewhat out of her time, who took the longer view of things. She teaches culture and civilization as an evening class to mature students at an outpost of London University. And she seeks to make them think in a different way from other teachers. She believes in both rigor and fun. she says at the start of her introduction to her course that I shall expect rigor from you, but I also expect that the course will be fun. And it was that sort of woman, a woman of great intelligence and culture who doesn't bother with the superficial things that most of us bother with as well, like, you know, sport and stuff like that. Not interested. And whom Neil, the narrator, who's in his early 30s and whose life has gone off track, and like many in that position, they think, well, I'll try to become serious again. I'll take an evening course in something, and that's what he does. And you know, it's a kind of love story. It's an undeclared love story. He never tells her that he loves her, but he sort of does. And in a way, he almost loves her more after she's died than in her presence, which can be a bit intimidating.
What is it about, you begin the novel by saying she stood before us without notes, books, or nerves. She is very precise, and yet will give the students, tell them that there is a list of readings. You don't have to read them. These are things that you can look at, you don't have to look at. And so she's pointing them in a direction, but not being overly precise.
Yes, exactly. She wants them to think for themselves. That's her major task. And also it's a one-year course, which will then lead on to another year at the end of which they'll have examinations. So she can be slightly free with what she teaches them. And she doesn't want them to think, oh, I'll read this book and then I'll know what to think. She wants them to come to the books after having thought for themselves. So for instance, and she talks about non-academic subjects. She wants them to talk about love and sex and things like that. For instance, she doesn't say Goethe, the famous German writer, when he was nearly on his deathbed, announced that he had only been happy for 1/4 of an hour of his life. She says, someone who is famous and dying said the following. Now, the tactic there is, if she says Goethe said, all the students will touch their forelocks and say, Goethe, yes, German poet, yes, great man. What have I read? What haven't I read? More likely, I haven't read Elective Affinities. Have I read a bit of Faust? No, I think I just know his name. And they'd be on the back foot. Whereas if she invites them to consider the question of whether at the end of your life, and you look back, how much time were you actually happy, and whether this guy is a completely eccentric figure or maybe someone more typical than we like to admit, that's a way of getting them to think for themselves. And of course, the thing about teaching is that I've taught a bit. I taught for a year in France. I taught for a semester at Hopkins 20 years ago. One thing you quickly realize is you aren't the best teacher for everybody. I was teaching creative writing at Hopkins, and I knew that I would be a better teacher for some of the students than others. And it would just, cross-casting. There was a very nice guy who got on with socially very well, but who only wrote Gen X stories. Now, I'm not the best judge of that stuff, and I'm not the best person to point him in a slightly different direction, or you could refine this, or what about that, or so I knew that I couldn't serve him the best. And Elizabeth Finch recognizes this. She says at the start, I won't necessarily be the teacher that all of you require, but she hits the spot absolutely with Neil, who is the narrator.
I think it's fascinating, and if I'm jumping to a conclusion, please let me know. But I found it fascinating in your description of just a moment ago of using Goethe and of how she does not give it chapter and verse, and yet leads them down a path and allows them to fill in the blanks. I notice this novel is as many, not all, but many of your works is slight, and you seem to
no, we don't say slight. No, we say
short,
compact.
compact.
No, we say compact.
I like compact. We'll go with compact.
Yes, I don't like slight.
No, I don't. Well, yes, I didn't mean it that way, of course. But the point is that you are not someone who is going to write about the 5 pages of the gravel under the foot and the shoe of Elizabeth. You are just going to put her in the room, right? I mean, that is also how you write this, and we'll get to the second section of the book, which is the essay that Neil writes. But you bring us there in a very spare way.
I think this is partly to do with age. I have written long books in the past. I wrote a 500-page novel some years ago called Arthur and George. But I find in my later and leaner years, the desire to cut to the chase is stronger, and so it opens with her speaking directly to the students and to us, the reader. And we don't know where she is or anything like that. And I could have, I could have started it. Neil, what's his face, trudged across the courtyard towards the lecture hall. It was a rainy day. The concrete walls looked stained with bird, whatever. I know this might go out on the radio. Stained by birds. Let's put it that way. But I mean, to take a comparison with a great composer, Verdi, in old age, said, "I have learnt how to write fewer notes," and I thought that was fascinating because he was a big 3-5 act composer, and then his latest works, which he wrote in his 80s, which are masterpieces, were much shorter. And I think if you can say in 180 pages, 179 pages, you can say enough in that time.
In going back to something you said earlier about obviously this being a course for adults, and Neil is in his 30s, and he ultimately falls, as you said, he falls for Elizabeth, and while that is perhaps more intense after she is gone, it still is very much there as she is teaching him. But that idea of what he wants to accomplish by taking that course, it's a sense led by a sense of seriousness, right? Of wanting to be someone.
Yes. He says at one point, I had the feeling that I was being taken to a place of seriousness for once in my life by Elizabeth Finch. And he obviously never declares his love, and it only comes into focus later in the book. But he certainly loves her. It would have been a disaster had he declared it. She to a certain extent keeps him under control. After he leaves the university, they have regular lunches, but it's absolutely on her terms: where, when, how long, and so forth. And she is extremely generous and straightforward with her time that she allots to him, but he knows not to try and cross any barriers.
Julian Barnes is our guest on this week's book show. We are talking about his new novel, Elizabeth Finch. So let's stay on that for a moment, because the lunches are fascinating, because as you say, she sets the tone. There's 75 minutes. She always pays.
Yes.
That's important, that she always pays.
Yes. There's tight control. Yes. And she is older than him and has more money. So and also she doesn't think in terms of, the man should pay or anything like that. She just thinks, I invited him. I've got enough money for lunch for two, and I'm dictating that. And it's just a control mechanism. If you all insist on paying for lunch always, maybe there was a lunch I didn't describe where he attempts to pay, and she says no, we're not having any of that, or something. Yes. And she says a wonderful thing at one of these lunches, which was said to me in real life by a friend of mine. She leans across, they're having lunch, and he's ordered something. They always eat in the same Italian restaurant. He's ordered something that he hasn't ordered before, and she leans across to him eagerly and looks up at him and says, "How is that? Disappointing." Because she's a sort of romantic pessimist, and she is excited by the idea that things are disappointing, and of course it's a very witty remark as well, and then that's a phrase which comes back in the novel.
I know I have read this, but I'm interested in your answer to it of how of who you based Elizabeth Finch on, and was there someone specific? And I know that Anita Brookner, who you also had regular lunches with, was brought up. Was that there? Was that a way to sort of set up not the relationship, but certainly that idea of the control, if you will?
Yes. I used to have regular lunches with Anita Brookner, and she used that phrase to me over something I was eating. "How is that disappointing?" And it was so wonderful and so wry that I thought, I'll use that in the book. There was at the very, very early stages of planning, I wanted to think of someone with moral rigor and an unusual person, and I thought of one or two aspects of Anita, like the way that the way she spoke was exactly the same way she wrote. She spoke in perfect sentences. You could almost hear the punctuation, and it had a funny effect of making me try to do the same back. You wouldn't dare utter a cliche, but you would also try and put in semicolons and things like that as you were talking, which of course made it slightly stilted on your side. And the best way I can describe it is her exact relationship to Elizabeth Finch is, I once saw an actor interviewed on British television, I think it was Dirk Bogarde, and the question, he was asked, how do you create characters? How do you create the characters you portray? And he said, I start with the shoes, which I think is a very good reply. And you could say that I put Elizabeth Finch into Anita Brookner's shoes. That was as far as it went, didn't go above the ankle. And then she set off walking in her own direction. Because what Elizabeth, Anita Brookner wasn't interested in early Christian history and stuff like that. They have completely different intellectual interests and different, I think, private lives. And Anita, after all, wrote 20 novels and was known as a novelist, and was also a very distinguished art historian. Whereas Elizabeth Finch is a minor figure who once published a couple of short books, which are now long out of print. So there's the idea of moral rigor and wit. Yes, that's what I took from Anita. But it's not a roman à clef about Anita Brookner. That would be, I think, roman à clef is a very low form of literature in the first place. but also, why would I write a roman à clef about an old friend? I've written about her. I've written an essay about her after she died, and that's the way I would deal with friends, my relationships with friends. The other thing is, if you base a character on a real person, that's much more. It's much more. It controls what you can think and do with them. I mean, if you're making a character up, you can go in whatever direction you and they want. Whereas if you're thinking, oh, well, you know, my friend X, who I based this on, he wouldn't say something like that. It would just be inhibiting. I've never worked like that. You know, when I write nonfiction, I write about real people. And when I write fiction, I write about invented people. Simple.
It is after Elizabeth's death that Neil starts to write. This is the second section of the novel about Julian the Apostate. And this is the assignment, basically, that is long overdue. Yes. And is eventually brought, we read this, and as it's beautiful because this is such an amazing afterlife of Julian, and also gives us an insight into the afterlife of Elizabeth, at least in the sense of the impact that she had on Neil.
Yes. I mean, she's the part of the connection. She leads Neil to the figure of Julian the Apostate in ways it's not worth going into here. She's a contrarian. She's slightly out of her time, against the current of her time. And on a much larger world historical scale, so is Julian the Apostate. He was the last pagan emperor of Rome, killed in the Persian desert in 363 AD after only 18 months as emperor. And after him, there were no more pagan emperors. There had been some Christian emperors, Constantine and subsequently, and then he came along. And he attempted to reverse the rule of Christianity and its monotheistic nefariousness. And he was a very highly intelligent, scholarly emperor, also very good in battle. And it's very interesting to think what might have happened had he not been killed after 18 months as an emperor. Had he lived, you know, when we look back at history, there's so many what ifs which are worth pursuing for a novelist, perhaps not so much for a historian. What would have happened if he'd reigned for 30 years? Maybe he would have sort of successfully stamped up Christianity. What if Christianity hadn't taken over from the 4th century and become the powerful and oppressive force that it did become? Tremendous destroyer of Greek and Roman civilization. The violence of the early Christians has to be read about to be believed. 97, 98% of Greek and Latin text completely disappeared. The great villain, this is mainly happened in the 4th and 5th century. The great villain is the famous St. Augustine, who was all for, he had some wonderful phrases. He said that all superstitions of pagans and heathens should be annihilated. That is what God wants, God commands, and God proclaims. And so, you know, temples were destroyed. Christians were the first ones to start hacking away at the Parthenon, which is quite interesting. They're the ones who hacked off the gods' heads and arms and so on and so forth. And there were, you know, the greatest library in Alexandria in the ancient world, 700,000 volumes, burnt down. And so you think, if all this classical Hellenistic civilization had not been wiped out by the early Christians, maybe the course of Western civilization would have been different. That it would have been a more tolerant, more polytheistic world, where Greek and Latin learning and scholarship were admired and were developed. You know, we wouldn't have to say, oh, well, you know, the Renaissance came along, how wonderful. well, would have been no need for a Renaissance, because the rediscovery of the great civilization of the past wouldn't have needed to happen. I mean, I'm not a futurologist, let alone a futurologist of the past. But it's interesting to sort of think about alternative realities. I mean, I think one of Elizabeth Finch's great enemies, one of the things she most despises is monotheism. And I agree with her. I think the monotheistic churches all tend to punitiveness, intolerance, destruction of any sectarianism, and so on and so forth. Whereas the old Greek and Roman gods, it was much more tolerant. You know, when the Romans, for example, then they invaded Gaul and then and Germany, they obviously imposed their military and political power, but they didn't impose their theological power. They didn't say, we've got these gods, they're better than your gods, and your gods are rubbish and we're getting rid of them. They said, we've got gods, you've got gods, you can worship some of ours if you like. We're not going to worship any of yours, but that's fine. And religion was like a sort of sweet shop where you could go and you could choose your particular gods, which referred to your particular needs and interests. And you didn't think that the most important thing was to destroy other people's gods and other people's way of believing and praying.
Julian Barnes is our guest on this week's book show, the new novel, Elizabeth Finch. You have Elizabeth being canceled or a public shaming in
Yes.
this novel, which is interesting. It comes from like many of these things do, from a moment that I don't think she ever thought in the world would lead to such a fuss. What did you want to explore with that idea?
I suppose it was what happens when someone who's very self-contained and private and dealing with ideas comes into contact with the wider world of the tabloid press, it being a slow summer, not many stories, and someone picks up this lecture that she gives for the London Review of Books, in which she describes some of the ideas that she describes in my books, and there's for instance, there are three Julians in my book. It's the one on the cover, then there's Julian the Apostate, and there's the third one who's got Julian of Eclanum. And Julian of Eclanum had a great theological debate with St. Augustine in the 4th century, and he maintained that the sexual instinct, since it came from God, was natural and therefore to be celebrated, and was a matter of pleasure and no sense of guilt. He was crushed, unfortunately, by St. Augustine, who believed that it was, man is born in sin, and sex is a guilt, is to be filled with guilt. The act of sex must be accompanied by and filled with guilt. That there's an original sin which we can never expunge, and which is passed down from one generation to the next. And Elizabeth Finch says, imagine what would happen if Julian of Eclanum had won, and how much easier things would have been. And then she adds, and I'm not referring to what is satirically referred to as the swinging 60s. But moments like that, you see, and so she was describing that in her lecture, whereupon the tabloid press run it as a summer shocking story about top prof says Roman emperors messed with our sex lives. Now, this was not just some fantasy that came out of my head. This actually, I took my inspiration from that, from the fact that the novelist Hilary Mantel, about 7 or 8 years ago, gave a lecture at the London Review of Books in which she described the Duchess of Cambridge, the wife of Prince William, in a sort of sociological way. And she was sort of saying how perfectly she fitted what was required of a royal wife. The blowback she got from the tabloid press was disgusting. There was one paper which put a photograph of Hilary Mantel, who, as you may know, and as she has written about, so it's public matter, had a childhood illness which caused her to inflate and to sort of give her a kind of moon face. And so there's front page of a newspaper, Hilary Mantel on one side, and Duchess of Cambridge on the other, sort of live. Well, I won't describe her in case I get cancelled. But and the sort of the heading would, you know, who would you rather? It was sort of vulgar and disgusting, but it's what happens when someone strays out of the area which they're in and is sort of fed to the maw of the popular press. I mean, this happened in the 80s in my book. Nowadays, it would be a pile-on on social media. You know, they wouldn't. You know, as people are experiencing a lot at the moment. You only have to say one thing out of line, and all of a sudden you're getting death threats. I mean, literally. You know, J.K. Rowling says something about the difference between gender and sex, and she gets a death threat. This is out of kilter, surely.
Do you worry about it happening to you?
No, I don't particularly, because you don't think about those things when you write or say anything. On the other hand, you know, I've known Salman Rushdie for 40 years, and we see that what has happened in the last few months. You know, so I suppose I'm not going to write a satirical novel about Islam, but then that doesn't really come into my head as a possibility. But I can imagine, well, I think the Satanic Verses, if written now, would not be published now. And I think there probably is some self-censorship going on there, which is a bad idea, but quite understandable.
Absolutely. Do you feel yourself ever self-censored, or are you comfortable writing what you're writing?
No, I never think I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't go there. I mean, I'm sure that any writer who's written as many books as I have, if someone went through them with a fine-tooth comb, they can find prejudices, ideas that they think are loathsome. And then there's the other notion of cultural appropriation, which, if taken to an extreme, means that, you know, you can only write autobiography. If a man can't appropriate a woman as a character, a white person can't appropriate black, and vice versa. And you know, if you're young, you're not allowed to write about the old. If you're heterosexual, you're not allowed to write about other versions of sexuality. I mean, I could probably get done on that if someone wanted to do me. But I you know, fiction is a question of imagining the lives of others and presenting the lives of others to readers who are interested in the lives of others. And you can do it well and you can do it badly. There's an awful lot. I mean, even before we got into the complications of the present day, there were an awful lot of bad descriptions of women by men, and some pretty bad descriptions of men by women, more on the whole by men of women than the other way round. On the whole, you know, the great women novelists had men banged to rights, in my view. Whereas great male novelists, often tended to sort of sentimentalize them or idealize them. Dickens, dreadful children in Dickens.
Well, it's a fascinating subject, and certainly something that is a part and such an interesting facet of Elizabeth Finch. Julian Barnes's new novel is Elizabeth Finch. It is published by Knopf. I can't tell you what a great pleasure it has been to speak to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Always good talking to you, Joe.
Thank you very much. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Thanks to our partner independent bookstores for this program: Oblong Books, Books and Books, Book Hampton, Harvard Bookstore, R.J. Julia, and Politics and Prose. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue. Well, that was beautiful. Thank you very, very much.
Nice to have a conversation rather than an interview.
Yes, that is, I like that. I like that as well. Let me just remind people who are with us that, first of all, if you have a question for Julian Barnes, you can put it into the chat, and we will get to as many of those as we possibly can. Also, a reminder, the aforementioned wonderful bookstores, the wonderful independent bookstores, if you have not picked up a copy of Elizabeth Finch yet, you can certainly do it at one of those or an independent bookstore near you. It is certainly a beautiful novel, although just quickly looking at some of the questions in the chat, I think many people have already read it. So we will get to those. And if you're ready for the questions, sir, we can get started. Let's see.
Do I get to know who's asking the questions, or are they
yes, I will let you.
anonymized?
I will certainly let you know that. Let's see. In the sense of an ending, when the boyfriend, this is from Kathleen, when the boyfriend was visiting the girlfriend's family, did the family going on an early walk leave the boyfriend with the mother on purpose because she wanted to have affairs with her daughter's boyfriends? ? And were they checking him out? ? Very specific question.
Yes, I understand. No, it wasn't deliberate. He overslept, and his then girlfriend sort of was sort of in charge of him, and she didn't want to wait for him, so she went off for a walk with the rest of the family. He stumbles downstairs, and his girlfriend's mother cooks him bacon and eggs, I think. No, as many affairs do, it started haphazardly rather than consciously.
Let's see, we have this one from that. Can you talk about your decision to include the lengthy essay on Julian the Apostate?
What's the question?
The question is, can you talk a bit about your decision to include the essay, the second part of the novel on Julian?
It was always going to be there. I mean, often what happens with novels is you have 2 or 3 or more ideas, and they sort of, you spend a lot of time preparing to write a novel by just sort of mooching around and fiddling with stuff, and some of it goes away and some of it seems to come more into focus, and then sometimes ideas seem to come together. I had actually been interested in Julian the Apostate, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. I read a poem by Swinburne, the decadent late 19th century British poet, which contained the line, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean." And these were supposedly the last words of Julian the Apostate as he lay dying in the Persian desert. As with most early history, this isn't true. The words were invented about 50 years later by another writer. But the notion that there was a turning point, and the further notion, which Swinburne and many others held, going back to Voltaire and going on to present-day writers, was that this might have been a very bad thing and a very unfortunate death. And so that idea had been drifting around. And then I thought of someone, as I said earlier, who was also a kind of local contrarian, pointing the way towards a world historical contrarian, as Julian the Apostate was. And then, I mean, I don't think as though that's non-fiction and the two sections on either side of fiction, I don't sort of, it doesn't feel different to me, because I've often since Flaubert's Parrot had fiction and non-fiction in the same book, and it's a novel. I don't think there's a trench dug between fiction and non-fiction, and the novelist should stay on one side and then there are non-fiction writers on the other side of this trench. I just sort of go where the story is. I go with what interests me and what fills me with a passion to write about it.
We get this question from Christopher, who says, how do you create storylines that are maybe not as fantastic and as exotic as James Bond, yet are so incredibly magnetic and absorbing to readers?
Well, if that's a description of my work, I'm deeply flattered, and long may you read. You just, I guess, to put it simply, I think if you write about something, whatever it is, with a passion and a deep interest, and you set it out in a way which is accessible and at the same time alluring to readers, then it doesn't matter if the reader hasn't ever thought about reading a book which contains 70 pages about Julian the Apostate. Coming from the opposite point of view, from a reader's point of view, I'm often end up reading books on subjects I have no interest in. For example, some years ago, I picked up a copy of A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean, who writes with extraordinary passion about fly fishing. I haven't the slightest interest in any sort of fishing. I like eating fish, but I don't want to be up to my thighs in waders and throwing rods and lines and so on into the river. But the way he describes it brings it completely alive. And for the 250 pages, whatever it is, the reader becomes a fly fisherman, him or herself.
Let's see, we have two questions here that I think are interesting. One is from Sarah. Why were you named Julian, and what does your name now mean to you after writing Elizabeth Finch?
Well, it's my mother hoped that I would be a girl and I was going to be Josephine. I tell you that this is a world scoop for you on the Joe Donahue show and to a number of bookshops. Unfortunately, I was a boy, so I was another J. I don't know why they chose. I know that I can swear on anything you like, Dr. Johnson's dictionary, that my mother and father had never heard of Julian the Apostate. I think it's one of those, my brother's called Jonathan, and I think it's one of those things that my mother felt, if you have a single syllable surname, Barnes, then dumb. Well, it's Beethoven, isn't it? It's sort of euphonious. Julian Barnes, Jonathan Barnes, I don't know. I can't ask. But what's my name mean to me? It's so familiar. It's like saying, what does my beard mean to me when I shave it off in the morning?
We let's see, this is a question from Vanessa. Neil in Elizabeth Finch appears to be at a loss when confronted with Elizabeth's notes and archives, and doesn't seem to understand Elizabeth Finch much better after reading them. Do you think scholars may understand a writer's work better after examining their archives? For example, your archives.
As it happens, I know who the questioner is, and it is a pseudonym, and it's not a Vanessa, it's a male questioner. And he's very interested in my archives.
Which are in Texas,
which are in Texas,
right?
Yes, yeah, Austin, Texas, and they've been there for a long time. And I simply don't know. It's like I'm not interested in reading my own biography. I'm interested in what people think about my books while I'm alive. I'm interested in what people think about me, people who know me. But you know, the most foolish thing for any writer to do is to try and sort of second guess posterity and to think I must somehow arrange things, be it my archive, be it my books, be it my autobiography, which I'm very unlikely to write, so that they'll think nicely of me. No, some people are like that. I've known writers who've deliberately chosen a biographer who won't say anything bad about them. And the result is often a very boring biography. I think the only thing we can be certain of is that we won't be remembered in a way that we think we're going to be remembered. So I'm just going to, it's not one of the worries that is at the forefront of my mind.
With that said, my understanding is your papers, your notes, your work, the early drafts, you were very careful. You that meant something to you to keep all of that material.
Yes, it did. It did. I was obsessive about it, and I kept everything that I wrote, and I kept every draft of every novel I wrote, and the boxes moved around with me, and then at a certain point, I was about 50, I suppose. I just looked at these boxes and thought, well, I'm never going to look at them. And if the house burnt down, would I regret that? Possibly. I mean, it's a vanity both ways to think that people might be interested in how you write, or that people wouldn't be interested in how you write. So I thought at that point I would sell the archive such as it was. And I had a previous connection at Austin, Texas. I'd been there and been very well looked after. And I also thought, if you're going to leave sort of notebooks and diaries and stuff like that, I'd rather have them a long way away, so that someone when news is short in the summer, someone doesn't pop down to the British Library and discover something scurrilous in my papers and turn it into a news story and then get me cancelled.
I think this is an excellent final question. So I will go to this one as our final question. I just want to thank all of the wonderful bookstores, Oblong and Books and Books and Hampton and Harvard Bookstore, Politics and Prose, R.J. Julia, and of course, Catherine Zuckerman at Knopf for all making this happen. This is from Ryan, and it says, your novel, England, England, forecasted that your country would pull out of the European Union. It also mentions the death of Queen Elizabeth II and describes the struggles experienced by the royal family as it faced, quote, the end of the traditional monarchy. Question 1, what exactly do you know, Mr. Barnes? Are, as England suggests, a resurgent Scotland and Wales just around the corner? What's the future hold for England now that the Queen has passed and it's divorced from the EU?
Well, you know, an ancient gypsy put a spell on me in my pram, and I have this gift of foresight. It's true that I did have us being thrown out of the European Union and things like that. It's just lucky guesses. I don't know what the future is, either for the monarchy or for Britain. I think it was a disaster to leave Europe, and it becomes more obvious a disaster year by year. The Queen, though I am a Republican, the Queen was a very good Queen. She's the only monarch I've known, and most people in this country have known. I mean, the previous one, George VI, died when he died when I was 6, and I have absolutely no memory of him being king. So she's been the only monarch I've ever known, and she's done the unenviable in many ways job extremely competently. The family around her seem to be disasters of one sort or another. So who's to know what the future will bring? But maybe if at Ryan's suggestion, I'll write a novel about the future of the monarchy in Britain. No, that's it doesn't interest me at all. I couldn't get you know, I just said you have to write with passion about something you're really interested in. So we can rule that out. I'm not going to write a novel about the future of the royal family in Britain.
Well, in the meantime, there is this beautiful novel that you have written for us. It is Elizabeth Finch by Julian Barnes. And Julian, what a great pleasure and honor to speak to you. Thank you so much for spending time with all of us.
Not at all. I hope we do it again before too long.
A great pleasure. Again, I'd like to thank all of our bookstores. I'd like to thank everyone who logged in tonight and join us. Don't forget that you can get a copy at your local independent bookstore and any of the bookstores who are sponsoring this event tonight. To all of you, thank you very much and good night.